thank you all for coming. Today we're reading through Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. So let's read together. It says, "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, Let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, Indeed the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Okay, so observations.
It appears to me that the population at this time must still have been quite small. They journeyed from the east. They found a plain, and they dwelt there, and they said one to another. Would have thought the population would have been pretty small if the entire world could have traveled together.
Yeah.
Let us make a name for ourselves. And then it says, the Lord came down, which is singular, and then in verse 7 it says, Come, let us go down, which is plural. Now, maybe I read too much into the tenses of the words, but I'm just wondering, so Jesus Christ and God the Father came down? Could be, I don't know. Lord came down in verse 5. Let us come down in verse 7.
Yep.
And I wonder, do we get Babylon from Babel?
Yeah, from what I was looking up the actual words, and it's actually the exact same word all throughout the Old Testament. I don't know why they translate it Babylon, but Babel here, but it's all the exact same word. So it is the same place, apparently. As far as we know anyway. But either way, I think the point in the Bible is that the spirit behind the city is the same, even if it's not the same geographic location. It certainly wouldn't have been the same, like the same family ruler the whole time. You know, it spans so many years. But, you know, throughout the Bible, Babylon comes up as like the center of like man's rebellion. So, you know. But yeah, I did see in some of the commentators they mentioned that they expect, there's some speculation that maybe initially it was actually, what's it called, Christophany, the actual appearance of Jesus, or physical form coming down to see the city, and then after that, when he says "let us," that's kind of indicating the Trinity, But yeah, it is an interesting little note to mention, And then, to your point too, I do think that the population was fairly small. It's probably, some estimates I saw just 1,000 or a few thousand, which still is a lot, but it's small enough that I think if they could keep order and have decided together, hey, let's go move together, journey away from the ark, and settle down here. I think that, can't have been so many. That they would just scatter. Because eventually, even with the same language, you just can't keep order. So, yep.
Yeah, I was looking and they were actually disobeying God when it said, when they were talking about lest we be scattered. So they're saying they didn't want to be scattered. But in Genesis 9:7, which we talked about a few weeks ago, he said, be fruitful and might multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply. Well, is that the one? Yeah. But he said to go, to go forth.
Yeah, I think
they weren't
that's,
supposed to stay in one place.
yeah, I almost included that verse in our verses here, because it's so, like, one after the other, it's like God told them to do this. And then within, I don't know, maybe a generation or two, however long, I'm sure they still knew about that command. They still knew he wanted to do that, and they specifically decided we don't want to be scattered. We don't want to spread. And I think there's a few reasons for that, besides just rebellion. Anyone else? Anything? Yep.
I know this is just something from listening to some of the talk that you did for looking at this study, but one thing I thought was like quite interesting that kind of changed the way I thought about it was like when you see the word tower, like in my mind I always thought like something like a tower, kind of like a skyscraper type of deal, but like listening from what you were listening with one of the talks, it was more like a pyramid type of thing.
Yeah.
That had the stair steps, and then it had like a little building on top of it.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to go into that. It's not, like, the Bible doesn't say for sure that it's that, but I think it's fairly reasonable to come to that conclusion, and I'll get into why later, but, yeah, it is interesting, because, like, especially, like, children's books, they always depict this tall, kind of old skyscraper over, which is,
round and
yeah, not entirely realistic, because even though the brick and the asphalt's strong, it doesn't really lend itself to that. You really need steel structure, which they did not have, so. Anyone else? Okay, so before we move on, I want to do just a little illustration. Well, so the title of tonight's study is The City of Babel. Usually it's the Tower of Babel, but I felt that in this case, like, the Tower of Babel is supposed to be big and impressive, and it seems to always get all the attention, but I think what's more important to the point of the story, the point of this recording of this, I think part of the reason why it's in the Bible in the first place is because of the city, and the people in it. It's not what they built is part of it, but I don't think that's the main point. So, I was thinking we do a quick exercise. You could think of the pros and the cons of cities, just in a general, what we think of when we think of cities. Anybody have any thoughts? What's good about a city or bad about cities in general?
you've got a lot of people there, so there's more people that can do different things. So
Yeah, so it's like,
more potential for collaboration.
yeah. Maybe almost strength in numbers. I mean, that's not maybe strictly the case, because you could have, scattered farms and they come together. So, but I think that definitely there's such a center and so densely populated that there is a level of collaboration and like relying on other people providing services that enables more than you would if everyone was super scattered. Anyone else?
I would think sanitation could be a problem in a city. Drinking water and sewage facilities.
Yeah, they're always really dirty for some reason. Even in today's standards, like if you go to LA, it's not a clean place. Like the streets, it just has a certain smell, and the streets are obviously not clean. It's kind of wild. But anyone else? Crime, yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's a big one. And in some ways, I would think probably one of the main points of why cities, at least when they're run by people, is such a big problem. You know, like obviously you get crime out in the fields and stuff, but it's a lot less. You know, it's
More people, more problems.
pretty much. Anyone else?
Probably similar idea to pro. Also, the con would be like a little tricky to try to keep everyone on the same page. Like, what would be a good way to word that?
Kind of like hard to control the population. Definitely. What is a good word for that? Like,
Division.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in this case, I think in this case, the lack of division is part of why it was a problem. You know, it's kind of a unique difference in this particular city at this time was the lack of division. Anyone else? So one, especially back then, that you see a whole bunch in the Bible is just safety. And because, especially back in ancient times, usually a city wasn't just, here's all these people together living together. It's also like we have a wall, we have like a garrison, we have, oftentimes there was a tower of some sort of stronghold in the city. And so to live in the city was kind of advantageous back then because it was seen as a means of safety. Yeah, any other thoughts?
In industry, probably.
Yeah. Or economy, I think I wrote in my notes, but same, commerce, I guess. Which kind of goes back to the collaboration. You know, you don't need to all hunt for your own food if you can have a few guys that are really good at it, hunt for your food, and then you can, you know, weave baskets or something. Okay, so that's just a few pros and cons, a few good and bad things about cities. Just stuff to keep in mind as we continue. So, let's see. Before I get to the main points, one thing that I do think is interesting that several commentators pointed out is how this text has such a symmetrical aspect to it. You know, like it starts with, and they said, let us build, let us do this, let us do that. And then God comes down to look at the city, and then he almost answers their, let us do these things with, he said, let us do this, like in response to what they did. And it kind of reminds me of Moses talking to Pharaoh, and you know, God told him to throw down a staff and turn into a snake. And then they did, well, look, we can do snakes too, and they dropped, you know, put down their own snakes. But then the snake from the staff eats the Egyptian priest snakes. And so it's kind of like, I feel like often God uses that parallel of, look, like, even though you have your counterfeit, God's is always superior. God's is always the real deal. And I also think it's cool because it kind of underlines addressing them where they're at and what issues they're specifically struggling with. You know, it really shows his just attention to how they are, what their state of mind is, and what they're struggling with. Okay, so first section, I guess, is man's plan for mankind. It's basically the first half of this text. So their plan, they thought it would be a great idea. Instead of scattering, be united in one place. And chief among that, which was, you know, really the point, one of the major outcomes and aspects of the story, as I read in verse 1, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And we jump over to verse 4. And then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. so like noteworthy and almost kind of scary is the fact that they had one language and that they were united. It's almost, if you look all the way to Revelation, kind of a picture of that one world under the Antichrist. They're all united, all at the same time saying, let's rebel against God. And one important aspect about these verse 1 here is that actually the word for speech, it kind of looks like when you read it in English, it's just repetition, language and speech. But actually the word for speech in Hebrew pronounced dabah or something like that, kind of bit. But it doesn't relate just to the words, but what they're saying and really the intention behind their words. And even I was seeing in some passages in the Old Testament, when it speaks of the Word of God, it uses that same word, dabah. It's like, it's not just, random words, it's specifically the intention, what your intent is. So yeah, and I think that's telling here, like I was saying, how they're all united. It's not just like they have one language and one guy is telling them what to do.
Mhm.
They're all in this together, all saying the same thing. And the second point is their plan was to make themselves a city. And as we've gone over before here, pros and cons, I'm sure they didn't think of any of the cons. But, they wanted to be able to collaborate, have safety, protect themselves, protect each other, and have industry. But it goes way beyond that. It wasn't just the practical side. But as we see here in verse 4, it's, let's say, let us come and build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. And it wasn't just about making a place for themselves to live, but it was about keeping everyone there and exalting themselves. It was really a matter of how they wanted to react to God and how they wanted to, basically raise themselves up instead. But I do think one thing that's important to remember is cities aren't inherently a bad thing, even though they have good and bad qualities, as we've seen. It's really the residents in the city that's the problem. They're the ones that rebel. And I think that, and this is kind of maybe conjecture on my part, but it feels like maybe something that went through the mind was, well, scattering abroad over the whole earth, that's really dangerous. A lot of us are going to die, And so it's like they think, well, even though God told us to do that, we'd rather just stay here together. Like, why would we want to split up? It sounds like a bad idea. And I think that's kind of a temptation we all need to deal with. Even though, we get really so comfortable in safety and things we're used to, but God often calls us out of those things, or even, not even out of, to do something that's not what we ordinarily do, or something that's uncomfortable for us. And I think it's really important that we catch ourselves and make sure we do obey God and don't just, turn from what He's calling us to do just because we want our comforts. And really, I think that had they been walking with God, even though looking out in the wilderness it looked scary and dangerous, had they been walking with Him and trusted Him, they would have known He would have kept them safe. Kind of really like Abraham was with God. God told him to go out, to a place He didn't even tell him where He was going, and he still followed him because he trusted God. And the third thing that they did is that tower. They said they wanted to reach up to the heavens, whose top is in the heavens. So as I said before, the Bible's not very specific on the tower, other than it was very tall, obviously. Though I do think there's kind of a double meaning there, because its top is in the heavens. as we'll see, that it seemed to also have some sort of religious implications. But at the very least, regardless of false religion, it was meant as a status symbol, as like a marker of like, look how strong we are. Anybody else who's scattered about in the valley or wherever, you know, probably could see the city, see that tower especially, and go there. You know, it's like a big beacon of come over here, don't scatter. But most of the commentators that I've looked at, they speculate it's probably was actually what they call a ziggurat, which is an example of one. That one in particular, they think is what the ziggurat that Nebuchadnezzar apparently built. Apparently as a reconstruction, or he was trying to rebuild the actual Tower of Babel, which sounds very much like something Nebuchadnezzar would do. That's what they think it looked like. I think it was actually huge. And like Hannah mentioned, you know, it's, you know, the construction is partly because of what it's made out of. You know, they couldn't just build straight up, they had to have a big white base. But because of that, you ended up with a much more imposing structure. Here's another example of one that's a little bit more basic. And there is another thought that I saw from the Jewish historian Josephus. He speculated part of their thought may have been they wanted to thwart God, quote unquote, if he flooded the earth again, which sounds really ridiculous to us because we know that God promised he would do that. But if they were so rebellious to God, I'm, you know, I guess in their mindset, why would we trust God with that? And so Josephus points out, though, that the word for asphalt is the same as the word for the bitumen that Noah used to steal the ark. And so because of that, the tower is inherently somewhat, you know, I guess it would be a bit waterproof. I don't know if it would necessarily huge flood, but that may have been the thinking. Either way, it's very, you know, their mindset is let's fight back against God. Let's not let him wash us away again. So yeah, so that's their city, all in all very rebellious, almost every way. I mean, there's some good, I think there's, you know, it starts out looking like they're doing okay. Let's, you know, they moved out, let's settle here. That's not bad technically. Let's build a city, that's not bad technically. And then they go, let's make our name great, let's build a tower. That's where they go off track. So after all that, we get to God's plan for mankind. And the first thing, one point I forgot to mention, because it was a ziggurat, they were almost always, that I could find, every situation, like every instance, it was related to pagan worship. It was always either we go up there to meet the gods up on the top, or we'll just send our king up and then he can claim that he met with gods and he comes out with some decree, which is really just an excuse, I would think, for him to say whatever he wants. But the other thing with the shape of the ziggurat that's really kind of striking to me is it's supposed to look like a mountain peak. It's supposed to be an artificial mountain. It's like this is where we have created our own site that we can meet up with God or a God or whatever, you know, like, and often in the scripture, God uses mountains to meet with, you know, like he met with Moses on a mountain, and, you know, they just came from a mountain where God had dropped them off in the ark. So, you know, I can see why they would see that as a significant thing, you know, the mountain peaks. But it's just such a typical thing of man to make our own fake one. It's like one of the earliest forms of idolatry, really. But in contrast to that, instead of them trying to reach God, God comes down to see the city, to meet with the people, you know. And really, it's like no matter how tall we build, no matter what we do, no matter how good we are, how perfect our religion is, we can't reach God. You know, we have relying on him to come down and meet us, you know, that's what Jesus came to do. Now, you look on verse 5, you know, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, and some commentators point out that seems kind of ironic. It's like, here they are saying, look at this amazing tower in a huge city, like, we're huge, we're amazing. And then God's like, I can't see it, I need to get it closer. But, and I think it is maybe making that point to some extent, because it is just showing how meager it really is of what they're trying to do. But I don't know, when I read it, what also comes to mind is it reminds me of when I was in art class, and we would all, everybody in the class would get on one single assignment, we'd all work on our own drawing. And then while we're working on that, the professor is walking around the room checking up on everybody. And he doesn't always say anything, he doesn't usually intervene or whatever, unless he has to. But he's always aware, just like God obviously was always aware that they were building this. It's not like he's just like, whoa, they built the city. You know, he knew what they were doing, what they're up to the whole time. But like, you know, the illustration of the art professor, he kind of would come in when you really need it. You know, like he'd see, okay, they're still busy, still working on it. We'll see what comes of it. And then, you know, then eventually he'd kind of come alongside and say, hey, what about that? What about this? And it kind of, to me, it kind of reads the same way, where God gave them time to build something, you know, do something with their energy and their time. And now it's kind of like a evaluation in a way. It's like, let's see how they're doing. And then, unfortunately, what he saw wasn't the best. Well, and another thing I thought was interesting, I hadn't seen this anywhere else except one commentator picked up on this. It really implies that God was not there. And not that God wasn't aware, but that they had never invited God in throughout the whole time. That they never said, hey God, should we do this? Can you help us with a good building design or whatever? You know, they never invited him down. They really didn't want him there at all. And so, you know, which is not a good place to be, that's for sure. Okay, so then the second thing, at least in this story, that's God's plan is really to save mankind from himself. And if you look at what God says, the Lord said, indeed the people are one and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing they propose to do will be withheld from them. And it's just, you know, God sees our hearts and he sees the future. You know, that's, I think, really what he's concerned. He's not concerned with what their building style is or how big the tower is. He doesn't care about that. He cares about why. You know, why did they build this? What are they trying to do? And, you know, like, I feel like this verse in particular, I think it kind of gets maybe played up a little bit more than it should. Because, like, when I was a kid, I'd see when God says, now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them, or in some translations, nothing will be impossible for them. It seems like a really lofty statement. And, you know, as a kid, I'm like, well, that means God's saying that if we want to build force fields and teleporters and stuff, we can do that. But I don't think that's really exactly what he's getting at. I think it's more so a matter of control and power, you know, because they were all in one place, in one city, and being not scattered, that really just opens the door for some sort of dictator. And I think that's what Nimrod was, either during this or right after, is he may have been part of the ringleaders that started this, and then after God scattered them, continued his empire. But, I think that's part of why God wanted people to scatter, is because it safeguards humanity from being ruled by a single government, a single power. If you have different nations, then God has, he's shown, especially in the Old Testament, where he uses other nations as tools to either judge Israel or guide Israel or test Israel, and other, same for other nations. That even though it's different nations, I think to us is like a division. We see it as a bad thing. I think to God it's just a tool, And as we looked at last week, it says the nations are as a means to spread the gospel. It's a means to an end, to, I think, save as many people as you can. And had they all stayed in one place, then, humanity may have never even flourished that much. It may have become so, just a dominant force that people didn't spread out. There wasn't enough room, and then, it was always just, would have been miserable.
Right.
Okay, so that follows along nicely to the last point. God's plan was for man to fill the whole earth. Which, I mentioned is really also part of saving man from themselves, because if you're spread out, you can't dominate. But it says, "Come, let us go down," and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. And so I think really, like I mentioned before, we often see this as like a judgment. It's like, oh no, he scattered them. Or not so much that he scattered that was bad, but that he gave them, really put in a way division with the languages. But I think the better way to look at this is really just God intervening to make sure mankind stayed on track on the plan that he had for them to spread out and fill the whole earth. And if you think about it, it's really an incredible solution of his. It's incredibly loving and merciful. He could have looked at them and been all not again. I gotta send down fire and brimstone, trash the whole city, and start over again. But instead, he just addressed them where the thing that was enabling them, which is their common language. He got rid of that glue in a way that kept them together. And so then without the common language, they had no reason, there's no way to coordinate to continue building the city, and they really, I don't think, had much reason to stay, because, mankind being paranoid and falling, if you can't understand all those other weird people over there, you kind of don't trust them as much. And so it kind of inherently, even though it sounds like a bad thing, in this case, it achieves God's goal, which is spreading out,
That's right.
And then over time, as the nations build up and are able to learn how to communicate again, you can end up, with bonds again and people working together. But in a much more healthy context than just one government, one city. And yeah, so then the kind of ironic thing too, though, in the end, is that they said, "Oh, let's make a great name for ourselves," but then the name of the city, was known as Babel, meaning confusion, which is not a great name at all. But then what I find really interesting is in Acts 2, God kind of reverses this. He says,
Yes.
after the Spirit had fell, it says they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused because everyone heard them speaking his own language. I find it funny that it says they were confused. Now, because it was different language, it was all the same language. And they were all amazed and marveled, saying to one another, "Look, are not all these who speak Galileans? And how is this that we hear, each in our own language, in which we were born?" Yeah, I didn't include it here, but they go on quite a list of different nations that they were speaking
Mhm.
tongues in. It's quite incredible. And so another thing that I think we need to think about too is, once we all get to heaven, and once everything's all done with, after the end, I don't think that God would have us have different languages at that point. I think we'd all speak a common language. There's no reason for that division. We won't be fallen anymore and won't need that check, basically. And then, so one last thing, just to kind of bring it back to the topic of cities. Like I said, I don't think cities are inherently a bad thing. And it's pretty evident because at the very end of Revelation, after everything's all said and done, John's writing here and talking to an angel. He says, and he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her light was like the most precious stone, like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. And so it's such a different picture of a city than the one that the people in Sharon built. It's coming down out of heaven, and the glory is so much greater than what they have.
That's right, that's right.
And when you see in the end what God's plan is, it's so obviously better than what mankind's plan was. So,
Yes.
well, I went through that a lot quicker than I thought I would. So if anyone else has any thoughts, then feel free to speak up. Otherwise, it is a nice day out.
Good job, excellent job. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you all listening. See y'all next week. Before we go, next week we'll be back with Pastor Derek. We'll go through Genesis 11, 10 through 32, basically the rest of the chapter.
You got to close out.
It'll be the end of the study, and then in the summer we're going to have our discipleship study on spiritual transformation. Was it?
Yeah.
So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Excellent.